waiting expectantly. Kia ora tātou. Welcome and greetings to everyone. I'll declare open this first meeting for 2018 of the City's Planning and Environment Committee. There is no public forum and I'm not aware of any apologies. No one leaving early. Let's go to item 3, the confirmation of the agenda. I'll move that the committee confirms the agenda with the following alterations. Firstly, in regard to Standing Order 2.1, that option C be adopted in relation to moving, seconding and speaking to amendments. And secondly, as you'll realise from my message earlier today, that we add an additional item 4.5 in respect of recognition and acknowledgement of Ted McCoy. Any discussion? Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Wilson. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. That's agreed. I'll move in respect of item 4 that the committee notes and amends, if necessary, the elected members' interest register attachment A. Are there any further amendments? And that we confirm the proposed management plan thereby. Councillor, I'll move, and that was seconded by Councillor Stones. Discussion, those in favour please say aye. Aye. Against, no. Now that takes us to item 4.5 and was suggested to me by Councillor Wilson, thank you for that Councillor Wilson, that it would be entirely appropriate for us to recognise and acknowledge the extraordinary contribution that Ted McCoy, who recently died as you'll know, made to the city. Peter Entwistle's comment in the ODT 2 days ago really detailed most of the extraordinary contribution over a very long professional, academic and architectural life that Mr McCoy made, and I think that's worthy of reading, that list for those who aren't familiar with his work, but the contribution to the city speaks for itself and is extremely wide-ranging. And so what I'm suggesting is that we start to prepare a minute of recognition and appreciation of the contribution made to Dunedin by architect Ted McCoy, and prepare that for the Mayor's signature and that be forwarded in due course to the family. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Hawkins. Any further discussion? Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. That's agreed. Thank you very much. That takes us to the Part A reports. And the first one is the retrospective approval of the submission in respect of the Shop Trading Hours Act 1990. Ms. Rusher.
Thank you.
Would you like to make any comment further to the report?
No.
Do people have questions, please? Self-evident. Moved, Councillor Wilson. Seconded, Councillor van der Vis. No, I was just asking. Oh, okay. Ask away.
Why is it that when regarding item 3, the revision of subpart 2, shop employees' rights, why is it that the submission that I made on this quite some time ago, A, wasn't acknowledged, and B, appears not to have been noticed in this report?
That's a matter for the Chair. So Councillor van der Vis had provided a comment in the early circulation of the submission. Yes, and so he's asking why this submission was made in light of his comments. And my understanding is that the appropriate time to debate the content of the final form of the submission is here today, and it was approved by the Chair to be submitted in this current form.
Even though it's retrospective?
Yes. So, yes.
Okay. What is your understanding in this context of the word paramount? We're talking about employees' rights here. Paramount when Easter Sunday trading is available. I mean, it's a legal term. It's been used in a lot of Treaty Waitangi documents. What's your understanding of the word paramount in this context?
Just looking for it in the submission. Can you just point out to me which line?
Number 3 comes in the second last line.
So that comes from the purpose of the legislation. So it's not expressed using that word. The legislation doesn't use that word in its purpose provisions. The information that the Hearings Committee had before it when it was considering this matter was that it had been Parliament's intention to make those employees' rights paramount, and the position was expressed to the Hearings Committee that had not in fact occurred because the burden of proof, so to speak, or the requirement to prove something was wrong was placed with the employee, and so reversing that was intended to be a better way of giving effect to Parliament's intention.
So your understanding of the meaning of the word paramount is?
Primary, first, principal, most important.
All right, if we go to the Free Dictionary, or shall I keep this for comment later?
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Yep.
So the matter is now open for discussion. Councillor Vanders.
I have absolutely no trouble with any part of these changes except for item 3, the revision or of subpart 2, shop employee rights. My reading of this says that the conclusion reached by submitters was that this onus was inconsistent with the Act's purpose and spirit, which is to protect the rights of employees. My understanding is that it's not possible under natural justice, and it's not legal to give primacy to one group's rights over another, and that we in this country and in most Western democracies will assume that somebody is innocent until proved guilty. How this reads suggests quite the opposite. It basically requires that the employee's rights be paramount. Paramount in the freedictionary.com, and you can look at it in any other number of dictionaries, says in the greatest of importance, superior, or a less often used meaning would be supreme ruler. What this phrase basically says, and paramount comes from the Latin amont, meaning above all else, is that the rights of the employee come above all else. And this flies absolutely in the face of natural justice, I believe. I would be quite happy to vote for these changes if we simply dropped number 3. But number 3, as I read it, and as the definitions of the words in it suggest, basically is just not acceptable in terms of everybody having a fair go under the law.
Well, Councillor, if you want to make a move and amendment, you have every capacity to do so, but yeah, no one has moved anything. Next speaker is Councillor Garrett.
Well, given that, sorry, if I could just finish, given that this is retrospective and that it's already gone out anyway, and that the opportunity to make comment that I made a lot earlier was, as I see it from my point of view, simply ignored, it's rather pointless for us to even try doing anything with it now. It's already gone. Is that not the case?
Your comment was I commented earlier that I read it, and I don't agree with it. That was communicated to staff, and the opinion of whoever responded was what led to the submission that was made. So, Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment that I'm fully supportive of this submission, and in particular the section that Councillor Vandervis raises, because it was something we discussed, and certainly the indication I had from listening very carefully to our discussion and debate was that there was a majority intention around this. I was very interested recently, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to comment on the legalities of it, but I was very interested recently. I was at a sector meeting where the Ed Sheeran concert and all of the busyness around that particular sector anticipated was discussed in detail, and in fact there was the rights of the employees highlighted to the employers in the room to remind people to educate themselves, get up to speed, make sure that they're on top of it, and to ensure that their employees were well looked after. So I thought that was very heartening, and it was definitely prompted, I believe, through our discussion of the Easter trading situation.
I just want to highlight the Section 5H of the Shop Trading Act, which makes it very clear that there is no requirement that a person work, and it was that protection that this is talking about. And if that is the case, that there is no requirement to work, then that needs to be clearly articulated on the other side, that they shouldn't have to have the evidence of the process that is run by the employers to show them the requests of time to work and all of the process which is run by the employer, that the employer is in the best position to show that evidence, not the employee. So I'm very comfortable with, because of Section 5H, the wording of this clause.
Thank you. Councillor O'Malley.
To more or less follow up on that comment, if your burden of proof goes towards either the employer or the employee, it's who's in the position of power to basically win going in equally, and the employees are definitely in a weaker position. So the employees' rights, I think, do need to be put to the front. The legal position and the legal argument would come next, but the order of burden of proof determines where you are on the starting line. And I do think that given that the employee is actually in a position where they're often weaker, they do need to be put at the start of the starting line and not behind the employer, which would be the other way of doing this.
Thank you. Councillor Lord.
Yeah, look, I just wanted the point of clarification. I'm not sure, Councillor Van Der Vis, what the problem is there. The way I read this, it says that Parliament's intention to make employees' rights paramount when Easter Sunday trading is available. And I was under the impression when we had our debate, it was something the Mayor from the Chair made very clear, if after next Easter we get tales of bullying, that would be, or people forced to work against their will, that would be something that would perhaps be the catalyst for no future Easter trading. So I'm just trying to think where the problem is with that.
Thank you. Councillor Van Der Vis.
I'd just like to take issue with Councillor O'Malley's claim that employees are in a weaker position regarding any legal dispute. My long experience as an employer is that employees have the free access to Labour Department officials and lawyers who will go into bat for them, that the employer in this kind of situation very seldom will risk going to a tribunal, because those tribunals virtually never find it in favour of anything other than the employee. The idea that Councillor O'Malley puts forward, that the employee is in a weaker position legally, is not borne out by anybody that I know in the business world.
Further speakers? Being none, I'll put it. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, no?
No. Recorded, please.
That's carried. Thank you. That takes us to item 6, the Planning and Environment Non-Financial Activity Report for the quarter ended 30 September. We have Ms Yonu and Mr Blair. An apology from Ms Pinfold, who's in Wellington, who's on council business in the capital. Now, would you like to make any introductory comments or general comments about the report, either of you? No? Then,
Mr Chair, we're happy to answer any questions.
Then the report is open for questions, please, councillors. Are there any? There appear to be none. I'll therefore move its noting. Seconded by Councillor Hall. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. That's agreed. Thank you. Item 7. There might be some questions about this paper. Mr Fruin is joining you at the table. Thank you for, can I begin please by item 7, emissions targets. Thank you very much for the paper. I know you want to make some comments to it, one or both of you, but in doing so it would be helpful as you illustrate the history of other decisions by council in the paper, which I think is extremely useful in terms of our wider position. Feel free to traverse that and then we'll go to questions.
So I guess we're happy to come back to you with the next stage of what was the Compact of Mayors, now the Covenant of Mayors, and this is sort of the next piece of work that we have to do to fulfil our requirements on that front. Bill's going to do an overview of what we're saying in the report and talk through some of our recommendations.
Yes, it's a good opportunity to sort of situate this report. As you say, we've got some guidance that we've received to date. So yes, it's a compliance activity in some sense, but we're also progressing other work and ambitions that the council has expressed. So, for instance, the Te Aotearoa goal of zero carbon. There's no year attached to that in the strategy, but it's clear that that's a goal, and perhaps today we have an opportunity to put a year to that. More recently, we've had the Council's resolution in response to Generation Zero's call for a Zero Carbon Act at a national level, and there was support from that by the Council. In between those two things, we had the opportunity to talk to the Te Aotearoa partners and the Grow Dunedin partners in the same room, which was good, about their aspirations and concerns, if any, about setting a citywide emissions reduction target. And I think from the report you may have gleaned that there was a fairly strong degree of consensus about most of the choices that could be made by the council in that respect. And then externally and nationally, we've had a change of government, a change of direction with regard to a national target, and an announcement of work beginning on a national Zero Carbon Act. That raises some interesting challenges for us. Essentially, that kind of starts to... One of the first things that's happening as a result of that soon, we understand, is the establishment of a Climate Change Commission. And in some ways, we've been playing that role in a very humble and simple level of wrestling with what are the right numbers, what sort of budgets for carbon could Dunedin aspire to. I think it's important. We've demonstrated a very indicative pathway to either of the targets that are opted here. But they're very indicative. That is the work that a climate commission would be undertaking nationally, would be looking at a lot of data by distinct sectors and trying to work out what is a feasible but aspirational target in any 5-year period. So as this progresses, whatever decision happens today, that the next phase for us is talking to stakeholders about action plans. Again, that is the next phase of compliance with the covenant, but it is also remarkably similar to the sort of process that's unfolding at a national level with the establishment of a climate commission.
Thank you.
We've recommended, we've got three options here. We've got the Zero Carbon Act option, we've got the Paris Agreement option. We've recommended the Zero Carbon Act option, not so much because we have any particular insight as to the relative merit of the two things, but it more closely aligns with the Council's resolutions to date and arguably Te Aotearoa's goals. But legitimately, that could be subject to further consultation, and we've invited the Council to consider that too, especially again as these very same subjects are being consulted on nationally now. I think that's enough from me.
Thank you. Questions, Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to move a modified version of the recommended option in due
Perhaps you
course,
could tell people what you intend to move.
I can do that.
And we can have that up on the screen. And then in due course,
it is there now.
but it will be useful to alert people to that.
That's fine. I can read it out loud if people
Why don't you just talk about that, so that we'll read it out, or briefly discuss it, and then ask any questions you might have.
Sure. So the resolution recommends to council. This committee recommends to council that it, to give effect to its global covenant of Mayor's commitment, that it adopts the recommended option, a zero carbon emissions target, excluding methane by 2050. That a more concrete pathway of milestone targets between 2020 and 2050 be brought back as a matter of urgency, and that when further guidance has come out of the Climate Commission Zero Carbon Act consultation process, we commit to setting targets around methane in line with that. And then the adjunct to that is the committee requesting an update on the work being done to identify local options for carbon offsetting per previous resolution of council. My question is around some of the report refers to a number of policy decisions that need to be made around how we particularly deal with offsetting if and when that is necessary, whether that's restricted to within the district or within the country or verified schemes or whatever. How early in the planning stage, which is the next stage, will you need guidance from council to direct that, and is that coming back for discussion sometime soon, or does that need to be addressed at this meeting also?
It's quite a hard question. I think, we now have more restricted options for offsetting generally in New Zealand, so in terms of has to be national. And we did start some thinking with some of the partners in Te Aotearoa about some kind of local program to take advantage of the opportunities to generate revenue actually through offsetting. But I would say those are pretty early stages, yeah. So I think we'll have to come back to you on that.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson, do you have your hand up?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, I understand this report and it's really narrow focus when it comes to advantages and disadvantages, but I'm intrigued. When you put this sort of target in there, it's often seen as a regulatory stick sort of that we're possibly working at, but there are some real advantages that come with moving quickly on some of this stuff, I presume, both economically and quality of life, and those aren't embedded in the report, and I understand why not, but I'm wondering if they should have been there as far as advantages, potentially, or am I correct in that belief is probably the question I think that's just for Sandy.
I'd expect that to become more of a feature of the next phase of the task, which is the action planning phase. We've tried not to speculate as to what those precise actions will be, what their benefits will be beyond adding to the carbon account, if you like. We have shown a waterfall diagram pointing to some of the major sources of emissions.
Yep.
And that was really as a prompt for thought about the early sources of viable emission cuts. And if you look at, say, coal, for example, there are economic replacements for coal in the form of wood or likewise LPG. So those sort of things I think would be assessed at the action stage. Likewise, electric vehicles, penetration of those. So yeah, we've not tried to preempt that, if you like, not tried to create a potential total pathway, which would add up to a number, and therefore that's the target. A lot of the stakeholders, in fact, through this process, made that observation that why don't you start with the actions, add them up, and tell us what the target is. The Covenant of Mayors doesn't approach the problem that way. in fact, the Covenant of Mayors, as alluded to in the report, really assumes that there are certain actions that cities uniquely can take, transport, urban design, those sort of things, and that the city should be pushing that envelope, I suppose. So, interestingly, the Covenant doesn't pay much mind to agricultural emissions at all. Mm-hmm. There are no templates set up for articulating how you're going to meet your budget via reductions in agricultural emissions, which is just an interesting insight. So I hope that was not too long-winded.
No, and that's absolutely fine. Although I think the real opportunity here is agriculture. It's actually where you can grow trees.
Yes.
And so what I think was really quite interesting about that balance was the opportunity there to do some of that offsetting.
That was the other point of showing that 8% Indigenous forestry on that waterfall chart, just to underline the fact that we are talking in the zero, well, in both of the options about a net position. So that's what we mean by net. We mean, you know, an absolute level of emissions minus offsets.
Okay. I think when you're talking about moving away from sticks to beat people with, I think there is a role for the council in inspiring and encouraging stakeholders to be able to take action. And I think rather than continuing to beat people with a stick, I think that's what's got to happen now, like working very closely with stakeholders and the community to find what are people comfortable with, what are their ideas, what do they want to do first, because I think otherwise it does turn into a bit of a beating people around the head with a stick.
Well, well, on that case, I mean, I think some of the stories about electric vehicles where I think there's at least a quarter of the councillors now have electric cars, and their cost to the carbon deficit is far less than mine, which is a good thing. I'm just wondering, you know, are we collecting that data about our EV cars and those good side stories well?
Yeah,
to balance us.
We're measuring the council's carbon picture pretty firmly now, so we've done that for I think 4 years now in a row. Yeah. Whether we can be seen as a lead on that stuff yet in terms of our delivery of carbon reduction, I'd question that. But I think there's scope there for us to do some things. But yeah, we're definitely monitoring it.
Thank you, Councillor van der Vest.
Mr. Fruin, you've said that we have led the way and been playing the role of the new nationally funded Climate Commission. Given that we now have a Climate Commission that is tax-paid, why would we continue to use ratepayers' funds to duplicate what they are in a much better position to do nationally?
So the reason why we're progressing this work is because the council has committed to the Global Covenant of Mayors, and there are requirements to meet as a consequence of that participation. So the first being produce an inventory, which we did with consultant assistance, to set a target, to undertake some vulnerability and hazard risk assessments, but we've done all of that. I was merely making the observation that at a city level, that work is in some ways similar to work that will happen at a national level. It's not to say, I think I used the word humble, however. We're certainly not holding ourselves out as a panel of experts in any sense. We're approaching it rather than ground up, dictating. We're approaching it by talking to stakeholders about what's achievable. So it's a pretty inexpensive approach to the problem, I'd suggest.
But my question was, given that we now have a nationally funded Climate Commission, why would we continue to spend ratepayers' funds duplicating what this commission is doing?
Yeah, sorry if I can interrupt there. Like, we are not trying to duplicate work. I think what we are looking at is getting ourselves to the point where we can align with the national government moves, because we think they're probably going to move fairly fast on carbon, and that we will work with them. They're looking definitely for partners, really, central government. They've said that to us now directly, to assist them as they do develop their targets and as they do develop that work. And I think it's in the city's best interest to be close with that process so that we can advance some of the things we want to see in that work.
Okay, my next question is your recommendation of option 1, and that is that we have a net reduction in Dunedin's emissions, excluding methane, of 100% by 2050. Given that almost half of our emissions are agriculture, do you see any alternative to achieving this goal other than reducing agriculture to zero?
So the point of the Zero Carbon Act, its distinction with the sort of Paris Agreement option there, is that in excluding methane emissions, we're effectively excluding agricultural emissions.
Well, no, you're not, because most of the agricultural emissions that you can do anything about are tractors, diggers, and all the other diesel-powered trucks and transportation associated with agriculture, and this is all your classic transportation diesel use. So are you suggesting that by 2050 that all farms will operate without diggers, tractors, trucks, or any of the other vital pieces of infrastructure required for agriculture as we have currently, and even looking into the future of electric vehicles will continue to be diesel burning?
I think I've been quite careful not to impose any personal views in this space. And just with regard to the allocation of emissions, those agricultural emissions from diesel and petrol, if you look at paragraph 42, fall into the headings of diesel and petrol on that chart, whereas sheep, beef, dairy are the agricultural emissions with which methane is associated.
Well, I'll try another question then. On page 30, you talk about, you've got some interesting figures here. In per capita terms, that means for each one of us, gross emissions for the last year were 11.4 tonnes of CO2 per person. That's under Dunedin's emissions inventory. This page 32, paragraph 8.
Yeah, thank you.
Individual gross emissions are 11.4 tonnes of CO2 per person.
Yes.
Of the 11.4 tonnes of CO2 that I emitted in that year, how much of that was me breathing out CO2 as opposed to breathing in oxygen?
That's an averaged figure across the population due to the city's emissions as far as I understand.
Okay, whatever the answer is, given that a significant part of my CO2 emissions arise from breathing, and given also that agriculture makes up half of our emissions, the zero carbon aim for 2050, if taken to its logical conclusion, to me suggests, and I wonder why you've recommended it, that not only do we not have agriculture anymore, but we don't breathe either. What is it about zero carbon in 2050 that is even remotely achievable, leave alone a recommended option?
I move that Councillor Vandervis stop breathing forthwith.
Some of you might have noticed, I've just used this wonderful facility I have to turn other microphones off. What I wanted to say was we are wandering into the debate fairly directly, and Councillor, I would ask you, Councillor Vandervis, to remain courteous when you're talking to staff. The next questioner is...
Apologies if my questions haven't been sufficiently courteous, but surely I deserve the courtesy of an answer.
Well...
and I haven't had any of the 3 questions I've asked.
Well, you've asked a lot more than 3 questions, Councillor. Mr. Frew and Ms. Yono, do you want any response to the question that was just made? Which
I just think it's worth restating the point that we're talking about a net zero here, and so obviously you can never get to a point of no emissions of any kind ever, but the ambition that has been expressed in Council's resolution, previous resolution, is net zero carbon.
Right, we'll continue with questions. The next questioner is Councillor O'Malley.
Just a couple of definition questions to start with. On point 10, you've got that graph of the different cities and the different emissions that come. What is IPPU?
Industrial processes, essentially, including refrigerant gases.
Okay, thanks. And you note, and I'm just basically going to confirm that basically our profile has such large agricultural in it that it's largely due to our agricultural footprint. And then when you take that off, it looks very much like Wellington and Auckland in terms of the proportion of the rest of the things. You go on to talk about the two-basket model in point 11, which implies that you're separating agricultural from everything non-agricultural. Is that correct? More or less?
Yeah, more or less.
Because in the further down, it's more a separation of methane from carbon dioxide and nitric oxide.
Yeah, it's worth making the point too. This is not an arbitrary thing. This reflects the International Panel on Climate Change. Their view that what distinguishes methane emissions from other emissions is that they're particularly short-lived and therefore potentially have less of an impact on a long-term carbon budget. So there is some basis in science as well as...
And will eventually convert to carbon dioxide and water.
The lack of obvious mitigation opportunities in methane.
Stationary energy, I assume, is fires and heating. Is that what that is?
But yeah, it's mostly electricity. In fact, it's mostly...
Generation of electricity.
That's right.
Oh, so it's electricity that's coming from coal-fired power stations that come in?
Coal, yeah.
Yep. Okay, because my next question was going to be, are we separating deep carbon from surface carbon when we're doing this analysis?
Sorry?
Deep carbon, like mined carbon, carbon that's on the 10 million year cycle versus surface carbon, which is on like a 40, 50 year cycle?
I don't believe it's separated in our inventory in that way, so I would presume that it wouldn't be treated differently for the purposes of our target, unless we made a conscious decision to do so.
Oh, well, I'll save that for the debate section. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hawkins.
My question of clarification around net zero carbon has been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. I just want to get key clarification on the, as the motion is up, and get your input on it. So just for my thinking or my thought process, when you talk the two baskets of methane, just trying to get my thoughts around this, we're talking about separating agricultural from living and industrial, correct?
Yes, methane emissions from agriculture, yes.
Okay, so my councillor colleague next to me should not be afraid of, and the farmer in Wakawai or the farmer in Middlemarch or...
Councillor Elder need not be afraid. Forgive me, Chair. Well, I mean, that's entirely a judgment for the councillor, but clearly the zero carbon approach recognises, as I said just a moment ago, that the opportunities for mitigating agricultural emissions are not perhaps as clear as they are for other sectors of the economy, and that's one reason why the Zero Carbon Act approach appears to have been developed.
Okay, you were fortunate Councillor Stedman wasn't sitting beside me. Then the other question I've got around that is, when I look at the chart on paragraph 42 and I look at indigenous forestry, it's 8%. How many hectares of that of indigenous forestry are we talking?
I could get you that information, but not off the top of my head, I'm afraid. No, don't know.
So what I'm trying to get a feeling from is, if we had a farmer in, say, sheep or beef or dairy, and then saying, okay, how much forestry, indigenous forestry, would they have to plant to get a neutral balance?
For their neutral balance for their own account, you could possibly guess at that. I think, possibly not answering your question, but one of the things that's worth noting in the space of carbon offsetting, had a lot of positive feedback from stakeholders in support of local offsetting, but a lot of recognition also that schemes like the ETS or the permanent forestry sink initiative at a national level kind of presume large parcels of it becomes economic to account for carbon, the larger your parcel is. The small parcel stuff gets a little bit harder to justify or to accredit through those sort of schemes. That's something we're going to struggle with in the future, or it's an opportunity too, but it's something we'll need to address.
Okay, so are you, when you start looking at this and considering where the targets that are being put in front of us here, and when we looked at the graphs on paragraph 10, we're looking at, and as Councillor O'Malley said earlier, you take agriculture out, we're not much dissimilar to Wellington.
No.
Sorry.
I think that might be an assumption too far. I'm not sure, because we have maybe some more significant transport issues than Wellington. So without knowing that data in terms of comparing us to Wellington, I don't know that you can just take the agricultural emissions out and have a Wellington number. I'm not sure.
Aside from that comparison, I think what's certain is that in the action planning phase, we're going to have to get some idea of the potential scope for forestry offsetting within Dunedin City's boundaries.
Okay.
If that helps.
And sorry if I've missed it in this report, but what is the government's target? So I'm looking at 3.
So the previous government's target, which was expressed as a national commitment in the Paris Agreement process, was 30% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. And this wasn't a commitment made at Paris, but the previous government also had a commitment to 50% reduction by 2050.
So when I look at point 3 in this motion, methane reduction targets are set in line with the outcomes of the Government Zero Carbon Act consultation process.
So those national targets to which I just referred did not distinguish agricultural emissions from other emissions, if that helps. So that's one reason why they were 30% rather than some other number.
But this government is signalling that they will differentiate, so that there's a signal that things are changing at the central government level in terms of how we're looking at carbon.
That's exactly right. Those current targets that I just articulated are not expected to remain the current government's targets. That's the whole point of the Zero Carbon Act consultation that the central government has just kicked off.
Okay, thank you.
There not appearing to be any further questions, Councillor Hawkins will now, for clarification, you're moving this and it subsumes the other options. Should this fail, therefore, then we'll continue a debate. I found this useful because it is a much tidier process than amending or otherwise changing either of those other options. So we'll now turn to debate on the motion. Councillor Hawkins is moving it. Do you have a seconder? Councillor Gary, would you like to speak specifically to your motion now, please?
I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is another big milestone for us in achieving the ambitions that we committed to 2.5 years ago, I suppose, when Council signed up to what was then the Compact of Mayors, what is now the Global Covenant of Mayors, firstly getting a stock take of our carbon profile as a city, now today setting some targets, and then the business end of things over the next 12 months, putting together a plan for how we might achieve that. It's not just consistent with our global covenant commitments, of course, being a net zero carbon city is a key strategic objective of Te Aotearoa. It was something that we received a lot of feedback from our community on during the consultation process on that. It's been widely canvassed, the idea that we'd become a zero carbon city, so I don't think that necessarily needs further consultation, as was discussed in the paper. The only question really is when we would set that target by, and 2050 is essentially what the science tells us is the longest we can leave it if we have any any hope of achieving the global aspirations under the Paris Agreement. And I don't think that we have a chance of achieving those as a country without local and regional governments doing their bit to contribute to that, and that's what this is doing. We're fortunate now to be in a position with a more supportive central government in supporting this work, not just here locally, but around the country, as evidenced by the work that's currently being done on the Zero Carbon Act and the subsequent creation of the Independent Climate Commission that will guide this work. 2050 is by no means an ambitious target. It is the bare minimum. There are far larger cities with far bigger challenges in this space that are committed to doing far more and faster. This is the absolute least that we can do. I support the two baskets approach. I acknowledge that we have, thankfully for New Zealand, given our carbon profile, have slightly longer to address these not insignificant challenges around the agriculture sector and methane emissions. So I'm comfortable with committing to a target around carbon. I don't want to leave that challenge indefinitely though, so part 3 of this essentially commits us to setting some targets around methane reduction that are in line with the outcomes of the government's current, well, soon to be underway consultation process that they're kicking off in May, because there will be recommendations, and it would be remiss of us to not do our bit in doing that. I just want to quickly mention the carbon offsetting stuff. It is a measure of last resort. It will be certainly essential to some degree, but I don't want people to think that you can just plant a bunch of trees and not change anything. This still requires fairly significant systemic and behavioural change if we're to achieve these kinds of targets. But where carbon offsetting will be necessary, I'd certainly like to see us prioritise doing that work locally where possible, so that we have the best opportunity to accrue the spin-off benefits, whether they're economic or social, here in our community. So I look forward to is really to aid in the planning process. As has been mentioned by staff, it's a fairly rough guide outlined in the paper to cover both options as to how we might get there between now and 2050. But the sooner that we have more a more definite pathway, the sooner we can move into a meaningful planning phase as to what the actions might be, particularly in the short to medium term, that'll deliver that for us. So I don't think this is particularly contentious, and hopefully we can get through it without relitigating all of the background science that got us to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And Mr. Fruin, you see, has come to talk to us, and he is keen to ask you to consider to add the word net in 1 before zero carbon.
Which was the intention of the inverted commas.
So that doesn't create any difficulties for you, yep. And that makes a significant difference. Councillor Gary, are you happy with that as seconder? The word net has just appeared. Thank you very much, magic worker. All right, the next speaker is Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. I'm going to be supporting this, and I note the reference to farmers, and I think that anyone who's seen the farming scene in the last summer with the weather conditions we've had right throughout the country should understand that farmers are very aware about the end results and don't want the climate to change as much as anyone else. And on that end, I think that we also have huge opportunities on the targets to make a difference, a real difference. And while I appreciate planting trees isn't the only answer, and I concur with Councillor Hawkins in that respect, and I wish I could get an electric car that gave me the range that would get me home, and make that choice as well, but not yet. I think that it is part of the local solution, and I think that that gives a huge opportunity for some of the farmers to look at being part of the solution, and also considering the ecosystem benefits that they can also bring, having been to a workshop this morning on biodiversity. So I think that this is very consistent where most farmers want to go. Some will need more understanding and education than others. I don't think that it's inconsistent at all with where farming thinks the world needs to head. So I'm very happy to support it, and any concerns that people have about farming that's been expressed around this table already does concern me.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I woke up this morning and listened to the news around the storms in Tonga, and as we experienced the 34-degree day and then the next day storms, it continues to be a time when we need to be courageous, and because climate change is upon us, and we need to be really courageous and bold in what we do. And people are looking to us for leadership. It takes courage to do that, and I witnessed the Mayor at an event recently talking about, firsts in the city, and I'm proud of the fact of our resolutions previously, and I thank the staff for their work on this, complex and challenging, but I really like the way that you've taken the community with us in terms of the stakeholder work. We've obviously got a lot more work to do in that. For many people in our community, there's a lot of understanding to get, and there's a certain amount of fear attached to it, I think, for certain generations. So I see this as us continuing that work. I wouldn't pretend to understand the detail of it necessarily, but I'm certainly willing to be educated and continue to challenge myself in that regard. So I will be supporting this motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor van der Vis.
Councillor Hawkins has characterised this resolution as another big milestone. I'm reminded of a similarly big milestone several years ago when Councillor McTavish succeeded in pushing through an equally unrealistic and unobtainable zero waste for our landfill resolution. Now, the thing about Councillor McTavish's resolution was that actually, in theory, her resolution was possible. Of course, in practice, it wasn't. This resolution here isn't even possible in theory. Councillor Hawkins has also said that it's by no means an ambitious target, and he has added that it's the absolute least that we can do. This statement is provably untrue. Both options 2 and 3 are lesser options, which certainly we can do. We could vote for option 2 or for option 3, and these would both be not the absolute least that we can do. The idea that we can sit here and decide for Dunedin that we as a carbon-based species are not going to be producing any more of it by 2050 is an absurdity. You can throw net, you can push methane to one side because that's obviously completely uncontrollable. But the idea of running agriculture without transportation, the idea of running agriculture without tractors or diggers, all of these ideas, quite frankly, are simply pie in the sky. My personal attempts to limit carbon have been practical, and I feel the need to remind people here of them. I've been driving an electric car here longer than anyone else. I have been producing off-grid solar electric power at my farm for over 6 years now. And I've spent 30 years turning what used to be a small dairy farm into a timber producing operation. I'm acutely aware of realistic options for reducing carbon footprint, and particularly for reducing real pollution. And I do not include CO2 in my hit list of real pollutants. Given that there are reasonable options for reducing carbon. And these include the kinds of things that I've been doing for decades now. I think it would be far more practical for this council to actually make it easier for people like me to produce off-grid electricity, or grid-tied systems for that matter. That they should make it easier for me to be able to run a timber operation on my farm rather than the current strictures being added by the 2GP to actually prevent me planting millable timber and a good chunk of it. I believe that this motion in front of us not only has been misrepresented as the absolute least we can do, I believe that it is completely unachievable, that it's completely unrealistic, and flies in the face of actual carbon reduction things that we could be doing, the kind of things I personally have been doing.
Your Worship.
I also...
Oh, sorry, I thought you'd finished.
Fond hopes. And by the way, congratulations on the blue shirt, which I take it is to commemorate the passing of Bill English as leader of...
On the topic, Councillor.
On the topic, when we have been given an option 3, which is the status quo, continue engagement on an emissions reduction target, I think that is actually a reasonable option. I think that is the option which staff should have recommended, and I believe that is the option which any realistic, feet on the ground, people who actually operate, especially in agricultural areas, I think that is a much more reasonable way that we should go. In the event that this particular suggestion put forward by Councillor Hawkins is voted down, I strongly recommend that we go for option 3 and hope that we will look at what is actually achievable rather than have this pie-in-the-sky fundamentalism as presented by this particular motion. Thank you.
Mayor Cole.
Well, I can't help wishing that the Chair's admonition that we don't relitigate this had been listened to, because this is not about arguing the case again. This is about fulfilling the obligations that we committed to when we committed to the Covenant of Mayors agreement, or whatever it is, some time ago. And I think it is important that local government, it's been said in various quarters that local government or one little city or one little council can't affect much, whereas in fact all around the world it is subnational governments that in the main are leading the efforts in this regard, and their cumulative effect is going to be substantial, and it may be what makes the difference in the very long run. But in any case, despite the fact that we have already committed to this, and this is just the next stage in implementing it, we will eventually need to anyway. Councillor Vandervis is mistaken when he talks about there being a Climate Commission. The Climate Commission is not in place yet, and it won't be for probably at least 9 or 10 months. But eventually, the government has stated its intention of putting one in place, and they will set intermediate targets and contribution goals, etc. And this is just a way of being proactive about it and as I say, fulfilling our obligations at the same time. With regard to agriculture, there are completely understandable concerns in the rural community about bringing agricultural emissions into any scheme. And they are being felt to a greater or lesser extent all around the world. And on his recent visit to Dunedin, the Honourable James Shaw, who's the Minister of Climate Change, has made two things very clear. The first is that the intention is to bring agriculture into the scheme, and the second is that it needs to be done in a transitional way so that people affected have the opportunities to change their business models or whatever else, so that there is the least impact, negative impact on their businesses and livelihoods. But as he pointed out when he spoke down at the university, New Zealand actually has the opportunity. New Zealand has a greater proportion of its net carbon emissions from agriculture than just about any other country. And notwithstanding that, there's no other country, as he says, that agricultural emissions are taken into account. We have an opportunity in New Zealand to crack that nut and to set an example, and the reason that we have that opportunity is that we absolutely have to, because it is such a large proportion of our emissions. So, in conclusion, these moves are inevitable. We will either be taking them now and fulfilling our obligations under the Covenant of Mayors, or we won't, and they'll be imposed on us at a later time, either by the government or by circumstances. And the longer, it's a well recognised truth that the longer we wait to do something about mitigating our climate change effects, the more it will cost us. So we may as well be proactive. I have to disagree with Councillor Gowrie. This isn't really that bold and courageous. I think there's probably places that are a bit more, but it's what we have to do. And I think that that we're taking a responsible position in doing that and being proactive before we actually need to be.
Thank you. Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Looking at these parts of this motion, I was at first unsure about 3 until read it more carefully, saying that we're going to set ourselves in line with the outcomes of the government's policies. So that means then that effectively the government's going to be coming out with policies and we're going to keep ourselves in alignment with them. So at that point I'm relatively comfortable with anything that comes out at that point. There will be some people who say that zero carbon 2050 is net zero carbon 2050 is unachievable through the transport perspective. And that agricultural activities can't go on in the presence of the requirement to convert to other forms of transportation. I would actually like to bring up one of the members of the community board, Waikawaiti, who could be considered the most archetypal agricultural person I can think of, who sits on a community board, who, when he goes to an event, puts on his dress Roman sandals. And that would be Mark Brown, who runs almost all of his nursery on electric vehicles. So you can run, depending on the size of the commercial entity right now, an electric-based system as you go forward. And Councillor Vanderbilt referred to pie in the sky. I tend to think more of Teslas in space. We are targeting something out to 2050. And Tesla Corporation has run its first prototype long-haul truck across America run on batteries. The battery technology is moving so fast. And I want to say, go back 30 years from where we are now and look at how we're operating. In 1987, we didn't have email. We didn't have the web. We didn't have smartphones. So 2050 is actually, I normally don't like targets out into the distance, but in this instance, considering the prototype long distance, heavy vehicles running on electricity have already been made, I'm pretty confident that in 30 years' time, they'll come out at an affordable rate that people will be able to switch. In the same way that we switched from traction engines to combustion engines, and before that switched to horses to traction engines. Technology, I believe, will actually be able to answer that question, and we will just need to keep in line with it. And frankly, I would acknowledge one thing, we're probably not going to have any influence over that, but it will probably change. I'm looking at our components when we take agricultural out. Waste is one of our big ones, and we do have control over that. And we are looking forward to what we're going to do with that. And I would say that if we adopt this, that actually will detect, that will come and severely, or not severely, but strongly influence our solid waste management policy. And we need to be doing that. And stationary energy, again, the question I asked about surface versus deep carbon, and I think this goes back to the agricultural emissions, and it's very relevant. For every tonne of carbon and methane produced by a ruminant, a tonne of carbon had to be removed from the atmosphere to make that. That's in a relatively tight turnaround cycle. That's in a steady state environment. And I believe that agricultural carbon emissions have been used as a conflating argument by miners of deep carbon, the Saudi Arabias of this world, who basically wanted to go, hey, look over there, instead of actually looking to where the real problem is, which is the mining of deep carbon and bringing it to the surface, which is a disequilibrium event. So when we talk about methane that's brought up from coal shales or deep off the Taranaki coast, that's deep carbon coming to the top, which takes us out of equilibrium. A methane made by a ruminant lasts in the atmosphere a few weeks and converts into carbon dioxide, of which the same amount of carbon dioxide was taken out of the atmosphere in the first place to make that methane. So that's a different thing, and we need to consider that differently as we go forward. So I'm quite glad, in fact, in some respects, that the methane's been taken out of this discussion, because I believe it conflates. I would hope too that when Mr. Shaw comes next time, that he meets with the whole council when we have these discussions as to how we're going forward. But I support this in its entirety, and I will be voting for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Laufiso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to acknowledge the staff for their patience with our belabouring of this topic, and thank Councillor Hawkins for the motion. And through the chair, for what it's worth, I commend Councillor van der Wes for the actions that he's taking as an individual. It's fantastic. And I also, through the chair, do take issue with Councillor van der Wes's statement that we cannot make these kind of decisions for Dunedin. And I just bring up the letter that was sent to us all from the parish group, that the Eco Parish group in the Mosgiel Green Island pastoral area, that said Council has made an urgent and important commitment to our children for a healthy future world and a stable and safe world in which to live. And these goals are maybe not achievable, but they're aspirational, and we have to take that sense of urgency on board. So that's why I'll be supporting this motion.
Thank you. Councillor Stedman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be supporting this. I believe we need to have aspirations to strive for. If we do the same thing day in, day out, we won't achieve. It's the same in business. Aspire, strive, or close up. Technology will change as it has in the past, as Councillor O'Malley said, and who knows, we may have electric tractors in the future. This is also an aspiration for generations to be the new Ernest Rutherford, for other people to come along and make new things. I wonder now, I'll finish on this, I wonder now that Councillor van der Wes has an electric car and some trees, this would negate his diesel truck and his breathing, therefore net zero carbon. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wiley.
There's a lot of this that I really like, but unfortunately I won't be supporting it. When I look at words like a series of targets and outcomes of the government zero carbon action, the outcomes of the government's Zero Carbon Act consultation process, when I read those, I have no idea what I'm really voting for. So what I would have, and what I really wanted to see happen today, was that we would have actually looked at option 3 and continue engagement on emissions of reduction of target. And the key words on this would allow an emission target for Dunedin, but would allow for specific feedback on the options presented. This may also bring all consultation to align with national consultation on a Zero Carbon Act. The advantage may allow for the adoption of council of target more consistent with a Zero Carbon Act once enacted. So that's what I would have liked to have seen us do. We do have to move forward, there's no doubt about that. But I struggle when I see some of those words in that motion for me to support it.
Thank you. Any further speakers? Councillor Stones.
Thank you. Councillor Benson Pope. Look, I will be supporting this resolution. And unlike Councillor van der Wes, I don't think that this target is going to be impossible to reach. It's not going to be easy, but we have to reach it. All of us are experiencing already right around the globe the effects of the early stages of the changes that global warming is going to bring us. And that's costing us a fortune. So we have to make some changes, and we're already on the way. Now, if you look at Dunedin, Dunedin has one of the highest adoption rates already of electric cars. It's going to be, the more of, I have of this philosophy, the more people who drive electric cars and enjoy them, the more people will go and buy an electric car. It's reached the point where the dealers who are importing the electric cars can't get enough of them to satisfy the market demand. So our residents in this city are open to making change. We're going as a city for LED lighting. We have higher insulation standards now for houses, double glazing, triple glazing. There's all sorts of activity that's already going on that is helping us move towards this target. What the target will do for us is give us a mandate to seek out and to promote new ideas and actions that will accelerate that reduction in carbon footprint. And I've heard Councillor van der Vis bemoaning the fact that he can't do some things that might create a greater carbon offset on his property. Well, maybe as a city, we're going to have to review some of those rules in order to reach the best outcome for the city. So I certainly support it, and I think we have every chance of achieving it.
Thank you. Further speakers? I'll make a brief comment before I go to Councillor Hawkins for his right of reply. I welcome this, and I'd like to thank members for who've made positive comments. I think the one dimension to the activity we're talking about here that hasn't been traversed but sits behind it or alongside it is that we finally are in the welcome position of having a central government in this country that is not ignoring or refusing to act on the issues of climate change. We had many years ago comments were made about New Zealand being a fast follower. Well, we've been the slowest non-follower that I could imagine, and I think it's a shame that so much opportunity has been missed because of that. That said, we have a government that, and I would say this, and I am, that is taking this extraordinarily serious challenge to our whole planet seriously, and I hope will lead to the sort of changes that we need to make in our community and communities much wider on the globe. So I'm looking forward to this city being a part of that. This city's been a leader in all sorts of social legislation and environmental legislation previously, and I think this, these resolutions sit very comfortably with Dunedin's history and even more comfortably with Dunedin's future. Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Free Dictionary defines humility as the quality or condition of being humble. It's hard sometimes to know whether Councillor van der Vis is fishing for headlines or medals, or both, perhaps, in this instance. By willfully ignoring...
The kettle black, if you don't mind. How many headlines have you got?
Councillor, please. Councillor, if you don't mind.
I'll expect your letter of complaint.
Carry on, please.
By willfully ignoring what the motion is on the table, which is committing us to setting a path to a net zero carbon. It's disingenuous and a red herring to suggest that we're going to try and to do that. We have to stop doing everything. What it means is minimise and mitigate what we can and offset the balance however we can. That's what a net zero carbon emissions reduction target is, as inconvenient as that might be to arguments against this motion. And Councillor van der Vis is right, we could do less. But I couldn't do that. Well, you could sleep well at night, but I couldn't. This isn't, and not really in a, oft bandied around future generations. We've got to do this for future generations. We've got to do this for the sake of our communities now. The pointy end of an unstable climate is something that is being felt by our communities now, and it's something that's disproportionately felt by our most vulnerable communities now. And I find the cognitive dissonance required to both be someone as actively and outwardly concerned about the effects of flooding on vulnerable communities in this city, and then turn around and try and argue that we do nothing to try and fix some of the biggest drivers of those conditions is Herculean and deserving perhaps of another medal still. I agree with Councillor O'Malley that 2050, I mean, it's easy to kick a target out to 2050 and then, panic at 2045 about what we've done to try and achieve it, which is why it's important that we develop a series of milestone targets on the way through to keep us on that track. And yes, Elon Musk is a noble man, apparently, and technology will be a huge part of how we can get there, but it's not going to fix everything for us. Electric cars and self-driving cars aren't going to get us to a net zero carbon position by 2050. We have to change the way that we are doing things structurally as well as individually. I welcome the support that this has received around the table, and I can't possibly support arguments from Councillor Wiley that we have to move forward by doing nothing. So I commend this motion to the committee as a recommendation subsequently to council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. We will take a division. With those, I'm sorry, would you carry out the division, please, Ms Adams?
Your Worship.
Aye.
Councillor Elder.
Aye.
Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hawkins.
Aye.
Councillor Lefiso.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
No.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Newell.
Aye.
Councillor Staines.
Aye.
Councillor Steadman.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Wiley.
No.
Councillor Wilson.
Aye.
Councillor Benson Pope.
Aye.
Carried 11-4.
Thank you very much. That takes us to the final item on the agenda, items for consideration for the Chair, and I am aware of one from Councillor Newell.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just something for the staff to investigate for us. I had a suggestion for the New Zealand Sports Walk of Fame. I think you've all got the email. Basically, it's a simple and effective idea for the promotion of our city and also illuminating a regular pathway to Forsyth Bar Stadium. The concept is to honour our nation's sporting heroes with an illuminated tile similar to that of Chinese Grauman's Chinese Theatre, where they put their hands and feet in the resin. This would be a wonderful and consistent media opportunity for our city. The tile will also be made of hard-wearing resin and backlit with LED lighting. There is a potential for sponsorship, obviously, to offset the expenses. The lights would be in many different sequences and obviously come alive, and all roads lead to the stadium. It would also provide a talking point and entertainment for the many thousands that trek both to and from events, and solves a practical issue of illuminating an otherwise dark and dingy sidewalk. A selection panel would be established, and just included some names there. Dame Lois Muir said that she's interested, also Dr. Dave Gerard. These people would be fiercely Dunedin ambassadors for our city. We'd suggest 10 recipients in the first year and 5 every year after. The criteria would be established with focusing on all sports, including parasport. And Ron Polinsky, obviously the curator of the New Zealand Sports Hall of Fame, has also offered his support to the project. As he says, it's a wonderful way to promote our city as a destination for the New Zealand Sports Hall of Fame, a fact sadly lost on too many. So.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you for putting some flesh on the bones of something that's been battered around for some months now. We'll give that to staff for consideration and discussion, and we'll come back to the committee in due course if they think it's a goer. Any further matters? In which case I declare the meeting closed. Thank you for your attendance. Have a safe and warm afternoon.
Thank you.